Have you ever wondered why some people can endure pain, boredom, and failure without collapsing? Do you know someone who seems unshakably disciplined, even when life becomes unbearable? What if I told you that discipline was never meant to feel good, but to make you free? Modern people often try to motivate themselves through pleasure, hacks, or temporary inspiration. When that fails, they assume something is broken inside them. Ancient Japanese philosophy approached the problem differently, through Bushido, the way of disciplined conduct, and Kaizen, continuous improvement. These systems did not aim to suppress pain or escape weakness. They aimed to transform the person through structure. This video is dedicated to anyone who feels stuck in cycles of self-sabotage, procrastination, or emotional chaos. Stay with me until the end. Now, back to the video. Have you ever gone through an entire day doing what was required of you, only to feel at night that nothing meaningful had actually been done? Do you know someone who looks functional on the outside, employed, responsible, composed, yet privately feels scattered and undisciplined? Why is it that effort feels exhausting even when life is relatively stable? Kenji Sato was 34 years old, living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Tokyo. From the outside, his life appeared acceptable. He woke up early enough, caught the train to work, answered emails, attended meetings, and returned home without incident. No crises, no visible collapse. But inside, his days felt shapeless. Evenings slipped into late nights of distraction, scrolling, half-finished plans, and vague promises to start over tomorrow. Kenji believed he lacked motivation. He told himself that once he felt inspired, disciplined action would follow. So he waited. He waited to feel energized before exercising, focused before working deeply, confident before committing to routines. When those feelings failed to arrive, he interpreted it as a personal flaw, something he assumed was missing in him. What Kenji didn't yet understand was that his problem was not laziness or weakness. It was the absence of structure. His days had no governing principles, no fixed rules that operated independently of mood. Each decision required emotional negotiation. Should I start now or later? Do I feel ready? Am I tired or just avoiding discomfort? By the end of the day, this constant inner dialogue left him depleted and quietly ashamed. Without realizing it, Kenji lived without a code. Not a moral code, but a behavioral one. There were no non-negotiable actions, no standards that remained steady when emotions fluctuated. In psychological terms, this meant his behavior was controlled by short-term comfort rather than long-term identity. Each small act of avoidance reinforced the belief that discipline was something other people possessed, not him. This is where many modern lives stall. When action is dependent on emotion, consistency becomes impossible, and when consistency disappears, self-trust erodes. Kenji did not yet know it, but his suffering was not a sign that he was broken. It was a signal that he was untrained. As weeks turned into months, something subtle began to shift inside Kenji. Though nothing dramatic changed on the surface, he still went to work, he still paid his bills, he still told himself he was doing fine. But internally, the cost of his unstructured life was beginning to compound. Small decisions started to feel heavier. Tasks he once handled without thought now triggered resistance. When he skipped a morning routine or postponed a responsibility, the relief was immediate, but short-lived. Soon after came a low hum of anxiety, the uneasy awareness that something important had been avoided. To quiet that feeling, Kenji reached for distraction. Screens, noise, and late nights became anesthetics rather than pleasures. This is how the breakdown began, not with chaos, but with repetition. Each missed routine created tension. That tension demanded escape, and that escape in turn produced shame. Kenji noticed that after nights of distraction, his mornings felt heavier, his confidence thinned, he trusted himself less. Yet instead of responding with structure, he doubled down on avoidance. Psychologically, Kenji was trapped in a negative feedback loop. The absence of discipline removed friction from bad choices, making them easier to repeat. Anxiety was no longer a warning signal. It became a constant background state. Over time, his nervous system adapted to this instability, interpreting normal effort as threat and discomfort as something to be escaped at all costs. The most damaging part was not the anxiety itself, but the story Kenji told about it. He began to believe that his discomfort was proof that he was incapable of sustained effort. Each failure became evidence, reinforcing an identity built around inconsistency. The more he tried to feel better before acting, the worse he felt. This is how internal collapse accelerates without discipline, not through dramatic failure, but through erosion. Without structure, the mind seeks comfort. Comfort undermines action, and without action, the sense of self weakens. Kenji did not yet see it clearly, but his life was shrinking, not because it was difficult, but because it lacked form. Kenji did not accept this slow decline passively. At some point, frustration pushed him to act. He searched for solutions the way most people do, quickly, urgently, and with the quiet hope that the right tool would finally fix him. He downloaded productivity apps that promised focus in minutes. He watched inspirational videos late at night, absorbing speeches about discipline and success while lying still in the dark. He set strict goals for himself on Sunday evenings, writing them down with a sense of renewed control. This time would be different, he told himself. This time he would push harder. But the pattern repeated. The apps went unused. The motivation faded by midweek. The goals collapsed under the weight of daily resistance. Each attempt ended the same way, not with insight, but with exhaustion. Kenji felt as though he was constantly starting over, dragging himself back to the same point of failure. What he did not yet understand was that he was treating discipline as a test of character rather than a skill to be trained. Every failure felt personal. When he could not maintain his goals, he did not question the system, he questioned himself. The conclusion formed quietly but firmly. Disciplined people are different. They are built differently. And I am not one of them. This belief deepened his suffering. Effort became punishment. Each attempt to improve his life felt like proof of his inadequacy. Instead of strengthening him, self-imposed challenges drained him. He was lifting weight without a training method, exhausting himself without adaptation. Philosophically, Kenji was acting without a framework. There was no underlying code guiding his actions, no principle explaining how effort should be applied, adjusted, or sustained. Without philosophy, discipline turns harsh. It demands results without offering understanding. It asks for sacrifice without explaining purpose. This is the suffering loop. Pain leads to effort. Effort leads to failure. Failure reinforces identity, and identity determines future behavior. Kenji believed he was failing at discipline, but the truth was simpler and more unforgiving. He had never been taught how discipline actually works. Until that distinction is made, improvement feels like self-violence, and the more seriously a person tries to change, the deeper they sink. Kenji was not weak, he was untrained, and trying to fight without a system. Kenji did not go looking for answers. They appeared in a place he had not thought about in years. After his grandfather's passing, Kenji returned to the old family home to sort through belongings that had been left untouched for decades. The house was quiet, heavy with dust and memory. In a small storage room tucked beneath folded blankets and unused tools, he found a wooden box. Inside were notebooks, worn thin, their pages yellowed by time. The writings were simple. No dramatic language, no promises of success. They described daily conduct, wake times, physical labor, silence, repetition, notes on posture, breathing, and restraint, observations about facing discomfort without complaint. These were not personal reflections, they were instructions. Kenji recognized the theme quickly. His grandfather had studied the principles of Bushido, the code that governed the lives of samurai long after battle had faded from daily life. What surprised him was how practical it was. There was no talk of motivation, no concern for emotional readiness. The writings did not ask how one felt. They assumed action regardless of internal state. As Kenji read, a quiet realization formed. Discipline, in this tradition, was not an expression of willpower. It was obedience to process. The code existed to remove decision-making from moments of weakness. One did not negotiate with fatigue or doubt. One followed the structure, and the structure shaped the person. Bushido, he began to see, was not a moral slogan about honor. It was a behavioral system designed to stabilize the mind under pressure. By standardizing action, it prevented emotional chaos from dictating behavior. Pain was expected. Resistance was assumed. The system did not aim to eliminate suffering, it organized it. For the first time, Kenji questioned a belief he had carried for years. Perhaps discipline was never meant to feel supportive or encouraging. Perhaps it was meant to be neutral, impersonal, reliable. What struck him most was the absence of self-judgment in the writings. There was no shame for failure, only correction. No praise for success, only continuation. The code did not care who you were yesterday, it cared only about what was done today. Kenji closed the notebook with an unfamiliar feeling, not motivation, but clarity. For the first time, discipline no longer seemed like a personality trait. It looked like a system. Kenji did not expect guidance to come in the form of a therapist. He had always associated therapy with comfort, reassurance, and explanations meant to soften pain. Dr. Hiroshi Takeda offered none of that. Takeda was an elderly man with a quiet presence and deliberate movements. His office was sparse, almost austere. No certificates on the wall, no motivational phrases. When Kenji spoke about his frustration, his lack of discipline, and the constant feeling of falling short, Takeda listened without interruption. He did not nod in sympathy. He did not rush to normalize the struggle. When Kenji finished, there was a pause. Then Takeda said something that unsettled him. "You are not failing," he said. "You are leaking." Takeda explained that Kenji's suffering was not the result of a flawed personality. It was undirected energy. The mind, when left without structure, does not become calm. It disperses. Thoughts scatter. Effort dissipates. Emotion floods into every decision. What Kenji experienced as weakness was, in fact, force without form. Drawing from both psychology and classical Eastern thought, Takeda described discipline as containment. Just as a river becomes destructive without banks, a person becomes unstable without boundaries. Motivation, he said, is unreliable because it depends on emotional weather. Structure exists precisely to act when motivation disappears. Kenji tried to explain how hard he had already pushed himself, how many times he had tried and failed. Takeda did not challenge him, he simply reframed it. Effort without method, he said, exhausts the nervous system. Repeated self-imposed pressure, without recovery or clarity, teaches the brain to associate improvement with threat. What struck Kenji most was the absence of blame. Takeda did not see his patterns as moral failures. They were mechanical, predictable outcomes of living without a governing system. This shifted something fundamental. For the first time, Kenji felt his struggle could be approached practically rather than emotionally. Takeda ended the session without advice, homework, or reassurance. Only one statement remained. "Discipline is not meant to motivate you," he said. "It is meant to hold you together." Kenji left unsettled, but lighter, no longer carrying the weight of personal failure. Dr. Takeda did not begin with encouragement. He began with correction. In their next session, he addressed the assumption Kenji had carried for years, the belief that confidence must come before discipline. Takeda explained that this idea was modern and deeply misleading. Ancient warriors, he said, never waited to feel ready. Readiness was a result of training, not a prerequisite for it. He introduced the principle of Kaizen, the practice of continuous, incremental improvement, not dramatic change, not transformation through force. Kaizen functioned on a quieter logic. Small actions, repeated daily, alter identity over time. The samurai did not attempt to conquer weakness in one effort. They reshaped themselves through consistency. Takeda explained the psychology behind this. The brain does not change through intention alone. It changes through repetition. Each time an action is performed, neural pathways strengthen. When an action is skipped, those pathways weaken. Willpower, in this model, plays a minimal role. What matters is frequency, not intensity. Kenji listened carefully. This reframed everything he thought discipline required. He had been trying to overpower himself with effort, demanding large changes fueled by emotion. Kaizen demanded the opposite. It asked for actions so small they barely registered as effort, but so consistent they could not be avoided. Takeda was clear about one thing. Discipline precedes freedom. Structure comes first, autonomy later. Without constraint, the mind defaults to comfort. With structure, choice becomes simpler. Over time, this simplicity creates calm. Kenji asked when confidence would arrive. Takeda answered without hesitation. After repetition, he said. Never before. For the first time, discipline no longer sounded like self-denial. It sounded like training, not a test of character, but a process of conditioning. Kenji left with a quiet understanding. Freedom was not something he could claim. It was something earned through structure, one repeated action at a time. The structure Dr. Takeda gave Kenji was deliberately narrow. There was no discussion of preference, enjoyment, or self-expression. Wake at the same time every day. Physical training immediately after rising. A fixed period of silence. Meals at set hours. Work approached in defined blocks. The instructions were simple, almost austere. Kenji's first reaction was resistance. Not outwardly, but internally. He noticed how often his mind tried to intervene. He felt tired one morning and instinctively searched for justification. He felt unmotivated another day and looked for flexibility. Each time the structure stood unmoved. The rules did not care how he felt. Takeda explained the purpose clearly. Emotion, he said, is unstable. If action depends on mood, behavior becomes inconsistent. The samurai understood this long before psychology gave it language. They trained to act without emotional negotiation, not because emotions were bad, but because they were unreliable. Kenji began to see how much energy he had previously wasted deciding whether or not to act. Each task used to come with an internal debate. Should I start now? Do I have enough energy? Will I do it well? These questions exhausted him before any real effort began. The new structure removed those questions entirely. There was nothing to decide. At first, this felt restrictive. The absence of choice was uncomfortable. But within days, Kenji noticed something unexpected. His mind was quieter, not calmer in the emotional sense, but less cluttered. Without constant decision-making, his attention stopped scattering. Mental fatigue decreased, not because life was easier, but because it was simpler. Takeda described this as containment. By narrowing behavior, the system conserved energy. The brain no longer needed to evaluate every action. It followed the process. Over time, this reduced cognitive load allowed effort to feel sustainable rather than draining. The silence was the hardest part. Without noise or distraction, Kenji became aware of his impulses. The urge to escape discomfort surfaced quickly. But instead of reacting, the structure required him to remain still. This was not introspection. It was endurance. He was learning to coexist with discomfort without immediately resolving it. Slowly, something shifted. Kenji stopped asking how he felt before acting. Action came first. Feeling followed, if it came at all. Some days were heavy, others were neutral. A few were light. The structure absorbed all of them equally. This was the samurai principle in practice. Do not wait for the right state of mind. Train the body and behavior, and the mind will adapt. By removing choice, Kenji reduced friction. By reducing friction, he regained energy. Discipline was no longer a struggle against himself. It was a framework that held him steady when emotion could not. The break did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as a single exception. One morning, Kenji overslept. He told himself he would resume the structure the next day. Physical training was skipped. Silence was postponed. By evening, the familiar pull toward distraction returned. Screens filled the empty space. The routine fractured, and with it came a sensation he recognized immediately: shame. By the following day, the old internal narrative resurfaced. He felt he had failed the code, proven once again that discipline was temporary for him. The discomfort felt heavier because it followed progress. Kenji expected disappointment when he met Dr. Takeda. Takeda did not react the way Kenji anticipated. There was no correction, no warning, no concern. Instead, Takeda asked him to describe precisely what happened. Not emotionally, but mechanically. When did the deviation begin? What conditions were present? How did his body respond? This is not failure, Takeda said calmly. This is information. He explained that relapse is a natural phase of conditioning. When new patterns are introduced, the nervous system resists. Old habits are deeply reinforced neural pathways. Under fatigue, stress, or disruption, the brain defaults to what is familiar. This does not indicate weakness. It indicates incomplete training. Punishment, Takeda warned, strengthens the wrong association. If relapse is met with shame, the brain links discipline with threat. Over time, this makes consistency harder, not easier. The correct response is adjustment, not judgment. Kenji began to understand that discipline was not fragile. It did not shatter because of one lapse. What mattered was response. Return to structure without drama. Resume the process as if nothing had happened. This reframing changed everything. The relapse lost its power to define him. Instead of collapsing into avoidance, Kenji returned to the routine the same day, not with renewed motivation, but with neutrality. Takeda summarized the lesson simply. Progress is not linear. Conditioning includes regression. The code was not designed to be followed perfectly. It was designed to be returned to. For the first time, Kenji saw that discipline did not demand perfection. It demanded persistence. Pain began to change shape for Kenji. During one of their sessions, Dr. Takeda introduced a concept that had governed traditional training for centuries: Shugyo. He explained it plainly. Shugyo is deliberate hardship chosen for refinement, not punishment, not self-hatred. Training through difficulty, applied with intention. Until then, Kenji had interpreted pain as a warning. Discomfort meant something was wrong. Fatigue meant stop. Resistance meant avoidance was justified. Takeda challenged this interpretation. Pain, he said, is information. But not all information means danger. Some resistance exists precisely because growth is occurring. Takeda explained the psychology behind it. When discomfort is imposed externally, the nervous system reacts with fear. But when hardship is chosen voluntarily, the brain responds differently. The individual remains in control. Over time, this builds emotional tolerance. The mind learns that discomfort can be survived without collapse. Kenji noticed this during training. The physical strain was real. The boredom during silence was intense. Yet something new was happening beneath the discomfort. He was no longer panicking internally. He stayed present. Each completed session reinforced a quiet message. I can endure this. This was not about becoming tougher in an aggressive sense. It was about trust. Each time Kenji followed through despite resistance, he strengthened self-trust. His identity began to shift, not because he told himself he was disciplined, but because his behavior proved it repeatedly. Takeda was careful to clarify one point. Shugyo is not reckless suffering. Hardship must be structured, contained, and purposeful. Pain without direction damages. Pain within a system refines. Kenji began to understand why discipline had felt so threatening before. He had encountered discomfort without meaning. Now pain had context. It was no longer an enemy. It was resistance shaping him. The transformation was subtle but profound. Discomfort no longer demanded escape. It demanded presence. And in that presence, Kenji found something he had not felt in years. A steady confidence built not on comfort, but on endurance. Months passed without ceremony. There was no moment Kenji could point to and call transformation. No sudden confidence. No emotional breakthrough. On the surface, his life looked largely the same. He woke, worked, trained, ate, slept. The difference was not visible. It was structural. His emotions still shifted. Some mornings felt heavy. Some days carried irritation or fatigue. But these states no longer dictated behavior. Action had become stable. The routine moved forward regardless. Discipline no longer required effort because it no longer required negotiation. What had changed was not how Kenji felt, but how his system functioned. Repetition had reduced friction. Habits operated automatically, guided by structure rather than mood. The nervous system, once reactive, had adapted to predictability. This created calm, not emotional calm, but operational calm. Kenji noticed the absence of internal conflict. He no longer argued with himself before acting. Tasks were done without drama. Discomfort appeared and passed without escalation. Discipline had become quiet. This was the result Dr. Takeda had pointed toward from the beginning. Transformation was not something to chase. It emerged as a byproduct of consistency. Systems changed behavior. Behavior reshaped identity. Kenji no longer needed to tell himself he was disciplined. His life reflected it, not in intensity, but in reliability. The code had done its work, not by healing his emotions, but by making them irrelevant to action. And in that stability, something unexpected appeared. Not excitement, not pride, just a steady sense of control, earned through repetition and held in place by structure. The proof appeared quietly, in situations that once would have unsettled Kenji. At work, pressure increased, deadlines tightened, mistakes surfaced. Where he once reacted with avoidance or internal panic, he now responded with sequence. One task followed another. No emotional commentary, no urgency beyond what the moment required. Stress no longer spread. It stayed contained. In personal relationships, conflict emerged as it always does. Disagreements were uncomfortable, silence at times heavy. But Kenji did not retreat. He listened. He spoke when necessary. He allowed tension to exist without rushing to dissolve it. The need to escape discomfort had weakened. Even solitude changed. Being alone no longer triggered restlessness or distraction. Without constant stimulation, his mind did not spiral. The structure held him steady, even in quiet. Others noticed. Colleagues described him as reliable. Friends sensed a difference, though few could name it. Kenji did not explain. He felt no urge to. Validation had lost its relevance. This was the clearest lesson of all. Discipline does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. It expresses itself through behavior, through how pressure is handled, how discomfort is met, how time is used. Kenji understood now that identity is not claimed. It is demonstrated. He did not feel disciplined in the emotional sense. He simply acted that way, and that was enough. The discipline code Kenji learned was not complex, and it was not gentle. It was precise. Structure comes before emotion. Action is not negotiated with mood. The system holds when feelings fluctuate. Process comes before motivation. You do not wait to feel ready. Readiness is produced by repetition. Repetition comes before confidence. Confidence is not summoned. It is conditioned through consistent behavior over time. This is what ancient discipline understood that modern self-improvement often ignores. Discipline is not an act of self-cruelty. It is compassion delayed. It is choosing discomfort now to prevent chaos later. It is removing choice so that effort becomes sustainable. If you feel broken, this code offers a different explanation. You are not defective. You are untrained. Your nervous system has learned to avoid resistance, not endure it. That can be reversed, not through intensity, but through structure. Transformation does not require believing in yourself. It requires building something that functions even when belief disappears, a system that does not ask how you feel, a code that remains when motivation fades. Kenji's life did not become easier, it became steadier, and steadiness changed everything. Ask yourself one question, honestly and without drama. What would change if you stopped waiting to feel ready and simply followed a structure long enough for it to shape you? If this resonated, share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing for more teachings grounded in discipline, psychology, and ancient wisdom.